A verdict that didn't just echo through the walls of a courtroom, but rippled across an entire nation, touching memories, beliefs, debates, and decades of unanswered questions. The Ayodhya Court verdict wasn't just a legal decision, it became a moment frozen in time, a point where history, faith, law, and emotion collided in a way that few events ever do. For years, no, for generations, people had spoken about Ayodhya not just as a place on a map, but as a symbol stitched into India's cultural fabric. The dispute surrounding it carried layers upon layers of stories, interpretations, archaeological claims, and community sentiments that evolved with every passing decade. When the court finally stepped forward to deliver its verdict, it wasn't merely wrapping up a case. It was stepping into one of the most emotionally charged chapters of the nation's past. The announcement triggered conversations in homes, workplaces, cafes, television studios, at parliament floors. People who had never visited Ayodhya suddenly felt connected to it. Some approached the news with relief, some with curiosity, some with caution, and some with mixed emotions they couldn't completely articulate. But one thing was certain: everyone wanted to know what exactly the court had concluded, and more importantly, how it had arrived at that conclusion. The verdict became a spotlight moment, one where the legal system faced the challenge of addressing not only documents and testimonies, but also centuries of faith, cultural identity, and collective memory. In a country as diverse and intricate as India, where the same story can be told from 100 different angles depending on who narrates it, the responsibility of passing judgment on such an issue was enormous. It wasn't simply about deciding ownership of a piece of land. It was about interpreting conflicting histories, weighing evidence that spanned eras, and recognizing the deeply personal connection millions of people felt toward that location. Imagine a scene on that day: newsrooms buzzing, commentators preparing, social media timelines refreshing every second, people leaning closer to their screens, waiting for every word the court would speak. Even those who usually didn't follow legal news felt an unusual pull toward this moment. It wasn't a typical case where one party wins and the other loses. This was a dispute that had lasted so long that entire generations had grown up hearing about it, without ever seeing a resolution. And finally, after countless legal hearings, testimonies, documents, archaeological studies, arguments, and counterarguments, the court's verdict was ready to emerge. But what exactly was inside that verdict? Was it a clear-cut decision or a nuanced blend of legal reasoning? Did the court rely more on historical records, religious texts, or physical evidence? How did the judges navigate through conflicting claims, centuries-old narratives, and modern-day expectations? These questions form the heart of the mystery that many people wanted to understand, but didn't know where to begin. This is where our exploration starts, because unlocking the truth isn't about taking sides or pushing opinions. It's about peeking behind the curtain to see what shaped this monumental judgment: the logic, the evidentiary trail, the legal frameworks, the turning points that influence the final call. It's about seeing how the judges pieced together fragments of history, archaeology, law, and human sentiment to craft a conclusion that attempted to bring clarity to a matter clouded by complexity. Think of it like opening an ancient manuscript, each page layered with context, each paragraph filled with arguments, each line revealing why the court reasoned the way it did. Most people only hear the final outcome, but the real story lies in the process, the reasoning, the references, the debates inside the courtroom, and the delicate balance between what evidence proves and what emotion demands. For years, this dispute was spoken about in heated tones, emotional debates, political rallies, historical essays, and community discussions. But what the court delivered was not a speech or slogan. It was a legal verdict, grounded in judicial methodology, and understanding that methodology is what helps separate narrative from fact, belief from documentation, assumption from analysis. So when we say this verdict shook the nation, it wasn't because people were unprepared, it was because people understood the magnitude of the moment. It marked the end of one of the longest-running legal battles in India's history. It marked the point where the courtroom became the bridge between past and present. And it marked a rare moment when the entire nation paused together just for a second to hear the same words at the same time. Whether someone approached the verdict with agreement, disagreement, or curiosity, it remained one of those rare national events where everyone felt compelled to listen. And even after it was announced, one question lingered everywhere: but how did the court decide all this? That's the curiosity we are about to satisfy, because behind that one-line headline lies a complex story with multiple layers: archaeological assessments, historical interpretations, testimonies, written records, legal precedents, and a structured framework of judicial thinking. Each of these elements didn't just appear, they were dissected, debated, and examined with extraordinary scrutiny. So let's slow down the moment. Let's rewind. Let's step inside the judgment itself, not emotionally, not politically, but analytically. Let us break apart the elements, the way a forensic investigator studies evidence or the way a historian studies scripts from the past. Let us unlock the narrative of how one of the most significant court verdicts in modern Indian history was shaped. Because when you understand the how, the why becomes much clearer. And once the why becomes clear, the verdict stops being a headline and becomes a story worth knowing. That story begins now. The Ayodhya verdict is one of those topics that almost everyone has heard mentioned at some point, whether through news headlines, conversations at home, classroom discussions, or social media debates. It's the kind of subject that floats around in public memory, often surrounded by opinions, assumptions, and fragmented pieces of information. As a result, many people know the name of the case, but far fewer truly understand what the verdict was, why it mattered, and how the court reached its conclusion. That's exactly why breaking it down in simple, digestible language becomes important. Most large court decisions feel intimidating at first glance. They come wrapped in legal terminology, historical references, document-heavy arguments, and long-form judgments that are not easy for the everyday viewer to walk through. The Ayodhya verdict was no different. It stretched across hundreds of pages, addressed layers of claims, evaluated decades of hearings, and stitched together material from multiple sources of archaeological findings, historical records, witness testimonies, legal precedents, and institutional guidelines. If someone picks up the judgment without preparation, it can feel overwhelming. That's where this introduction comes in, to make the complexity approachable, to simplify without distorting, and to give viewers a clear, calm, structured entry point into a subject that is often discussed with intensity but rarely explained with clarity. To understand the significance of the verdict, we first need to understand the scale of the dispute. The Ayodhya matter wasn't just a recent controversy. It had a long history that went back generations. For many years, the issue lived simultaneously in public conversations, political narratives, community memories, and legal battles. Each side of the case brought its own interpretations of history and documentation, its own perspective on events, and its own expectations from the judicial system. This made the case layered, intricate, and emotionally charged, something that required careful, methodical examination by the court. But here's something important. Understanding a verdict like this does not require anyone to take a side, adopt an ideology, or agree with every angle presented in the courtroom. It simply requires approaching the information with curiosity and willingness to understand how the court reasoned and what shaped the final decision. You don't need to be a historian or legal expert. You just need guidance that makes the journey easier. So in this video script, the goal is not to dramatize the issue or magnify emotions. Instead, the goal is to give you a clear path through the complexity, almost like unfolding a map. We're going to open each layer, look at it in simple terms, and understand its role. Imagine you're being handed a pair of clear lenses through which the judgment becomes less mysterious and more structured. For example, many people don't know that the case wasn't decided purely on sentiment. It wasn't about choosing one community over another. Courts don't work that way. Instead, the judges relied heavily on evidence, documentation, legal frameworks, and historical records to determine ownership, usage, and validity of claims. But before anyone can grasp how the court analyzed these aspects, they first need a calm and factual introduction to what the dispute was about and what the court was expected to address. That's why we're starting by framing the story in its simplest form. Think of it like this. If a viewer is about to watch a movie based on a real historical event, they'd appreciate a brief overview of what the event was about, who the key players were, and why the event mattered. Not the details, just the basic orientation they need before diving deeper. That's what this introduction aims to do for the Ayodhya verdict. The case involved multiple petitions, arguments from various groups, and years of courtroom discussions. Yet, despite all the complexity, it ultimately boiled down to a few core questions that the Supreme Court had to answer through legal reasoning, not emotional interpretation. And when people hear Ayodhya verdict, what they often miss is the understanding that this was a civil dispute, not a criminal one. That distinction alone changes how the case should be understood. Another layer that often gets overlooked is how the court approached historical evidence, because This case involved claims relating to centuries-old events. The judges didn't rely on assumptions or folklore. They relied on structured analysis, archaeological reports, documented surveys, and timelines backed by physical findings. Understanding how the court used these sources helps make the verdict feel far less abstract and far more grounded. But most importantly, explaining the verdict in simple language helps reduce confusion. In a world where information spreads fast and often gets mixed with commentary or exaggeration, having a clear, plain English explanation becomes necessary. It allows people to form their own understanding based on facts instead of relying on second-hand opinions. That's why today we're breaking down the verdict straightforward and clear, not to influence thought, but to inform, not to stir emotions, but to organize information, not to judge the judgment, but to explain the judgment. Because whether someone followed the case for years or has only heard about it recently, knowing the fundamentals helps them navigate the topic with confidence. When a subject like this pops up in conversation, most people feel unsure about what to say or how much they actually understand. But once the layers are simplified, the topic becomes less intimidating. It becomes something anyone can discuss calmly, logically, and respectfully. The deeper sections of the video will go into the core elements of the verdict, but we don't want to jump straight into details without first grounding the viewer. A good introduction gives the audience a sense of direction, prepares them for what they're about to learn, and ensures they're not lost midway. By the end of this explanation, the Ayodhya verdict will feel less like a distant headline and more like a clearly structured case. Study one that highlights how the legal system works when faced with deeply complicated disputes. So today, as we walk through the judgment in simple language, think of it as a guided tour. You're not expected to memorize facts or take any side. You're simply here to observe, understand, and make sense of something that has often been presented with either too much drama or too much technical jargon. Our focus is clarity, our goal is simplification, and our intention is to help every viewer regardless of background understand how this major verdict was framed, examined, and finally delivered. With that foundation set, let us continue deeper into the case and uncover the key elements that shape one of the most widely discussed judgments in India's legal history. When we say that understanding the Ayodhya verdict helps us see how the legal system deals with sensitive and complex national matters, we're pointing to something much deeper than a single case. The value lies not just in knowing what the judgment said, but how the court navigated a dispute shaped by centuries of emotion, history, and interpretation. This is important because major national issues often sit at the crossroads of law, society, memory, and identity. When the stakes are high, the legal system has to operate with precision, neutrality, and resilience. By looking at this verdict carefully, we get a rare window into the mechanics of the justice system under pressure, how judges weigh evidence, manage multiple narratives, interpret historical materials, and maintain fairness when the entire country is watching. Most people rarely have the chance to witness this process. Big judgments often appear in the news as brief headlines, missing the layers of reasoning that show how the legal system actually works. But when we break down a verdict like this, the inner machinery becomes clearer. Understanding this case helps us appreciate the structured discipline of judicial reasoning. Courts do not operate on sentiment. They operate on principles, precedents, statutes, constitutional boundaries, and evidence rules. In controversial matters, courts must balance two demands, staying faithful to legal standards while also acknowledging the societal weight of the conflict. The Ayodhya case reflects exactly how this balance is attempted step by step, argument by argument, document by document. One of the greatest values in studying such a verdict is that it dispels the misconception that the judiciary simply announces decisions. Instead, you come to see that every major judgment is built through layers of justification. Judges must write out their reasoning in detail so that future courts, scholars, and citizens can understand why certain conclusions were reached. This transparency is essential for accountability. By reading or understanding the verdict, citizens get the opportunity to evaluate the logic, the references, and the legal foundations used. A complex case like Ayodhya also teaches us about evidence hierarchy. Not all evidence carries the same weight. Some materials are considered direct, some circumstantial, some secondary, and some speculative. Courts must rank evidence based on reliability, verification, and relevance. When a case spans centuries as in Ayodhya, this task becomes even more complicated. You cannot simply ask witnesses who were present centuries ago. You must rely on archaeological reports, historical records, cultural references, land documents, and expert assessments. All of these show how the legal system handles time gaps, contradictions, ambiguities, and uncertainties. Another key value is understanding how the judiciary navigates multi-layered disputes. Many national issues are not black and white. They involve overlapping claims, religious claims, historical claims, political interpretations, public sentiment, legal ownership, civil rights, and constitutional values. Courts must identify which claims fall within their domain. They cannot rule on theological questions. They can only rule on legal ones. They cannot validate belief. They can validate evidence. This separation is crucial for preventing emotional conflicts from overpowering legal reasoning. When you study a verdict like this, you begin to understand the importance of institutional boundaries. Courts rely on what can be proven, not on what can be imagined or inferred. They rely on documented patterns, not on assumptions. This reinforces the idea that the legal system functions as a stabilizing force, not to erase disagreements, but to create a framework for resolving them peacefully. Another aspect worth noting is the methodical pace of the judiciary. Sensitive cases must move cautiously. Every argument is examined multiple times. Every document is cross-checked. Every witness is evaluated in terms of credibility. Courts are deliberate, not hurried. While this pace may seem slow from the outside, it ensures that no decision is taken lightly, and in disputes that carry historical or emotional weight, this cautious approach is essential to maintaining legitimacy. Additionally, analyzing a case like Ayodhya helps us understand the role of impartiality. Judges must detach themselves from public pressure, media narratives, political statements, and personal beliefs. Their responsibility is to follow the law, not public opinion. A verdict like this demonstrates how impartiality is operationalized in practice through strict adherence to evidence, legal tests, and established judicial standards. This kind of judgment also shows the importance of structured writing in the legal system. Court decisions are not mere declarations. They are long explanations filled with detailed analyses. These documents become reference points for students, lawyers, institutions. At future courts, the Ayodhya verdict functions not just as a resolution to a dispute, but as a learning text about how to interpret conflicting records, how to validate archaeological studies legally, how to apply civil law in religiously charged matters, and how to maintain balance between historical narratives and present-day evidence requirements. When people understand how such verdicts are crafted, it enhances civic literacy. Citizens become better informed about how major decisions are reached. They begin to see the judiciary as more than a distant institution. They see it as a system built to process complexity with care. This is especially valuable in countries with diverse histories and populations, where sensitive issues require structured and neutral resolution methods. Another benefit is that understanding such a verdict strengthens public trust. When citizens grasp the reasoning behind a major judgment, they are more likely to recognize the judicial process as thoughtful and transparent. Even if individuals do not personally agree with the outcome, they can appreciate the logic behind it. And in a democratic society, trust in the judicial system is one of the pillars that maintains social stability. Furthermore, examining this case teaches us how law interacts with history. Courts are often forced to revisit events that happened long before the modern legal system existed. This creates unique challenges. How do you interpret a claim made centuries ago? Using today's legal principles? How do you evaluate archaeological findings under procedural rules? How do you treat historical narratives that are partly factual and partly cultural memory? Studying the Ayodhya verdict shows how courts manage this delicate interface. Finally, understanding this verdict gives viewers a broader sense of how national disputes are resolved institutionally rather than emotionally. The legal system provides a structured environment where claims can be examined without chaos, anger, or disorder. It channels conflict into a process where evidence, reasoning, and procedural fairness shape the outcome. In this way, the Ayodhya verdict becomes more than a judgment. It becomes a case study in how a legal system operates when confronted with the weight of history and the sensitivity of national sentiment. And by understanding it, we gain insight into how the rule of law provides a foundation for navigating even the most complex issues with clarity, discipline, and constitutional responsibility. That is the real value.